You remember when you were a child, you recognize some of these books? As I look back and thought about some of the favorite children's books that I read and some of the ones that are still even famous today, it made me think about what you hear children say and what good memories they bring back to me. How many times did you hear, "Read it again, Daddy, read it again," over and over? A child never got tired of hearing a good story. But as we get older, not a whole lot changes. We love stories as well. We identify with stories. We see ourselves in someone else's story. We learn to adapt through other stories. We're inspired by stories of other people. No wonder Jesus used stories so much. He could take a profound boulder, if you might say, of wisdom and then tell a story about something and make it something that you could grasp hold of, that you could remember. He is the greatest storyteller ever. He could take a mustard seed and teach us something, a tree, see water, a piece of bread, a banquet that someone was eating at. A farmer went out to hire workers. A woman lost one of her valuable coins. There's the good shepherd. A feisty widow who just wouldn't give up. No matter what he wanted to teach us, he chose to do it in stories. But the most important thing about Jesus' stories was that his stories always pointed us to God's story. That's it. That's the beauty of Jesus telling stories. He convinces us that our story fits into God's story. When we would hear a story, we would stop and just go, "Wow, I understand what the lost son felt like. Wow. I wish I had a dad like that." Or we could hear a story and hear about a shepherd and say, "I need someone to look after me like that good shepherd did." If he can help a broken-hearted mother, then certainly I can find peace in him as well. If someone like Zacchaeus can be forgiven, well, there's got to be hope for me. You see, everyone has a story on this side of the cross. Everybody has a story. And what is so important for us is what Jesus wants is for us to have a drastically different story on the other side of the cross. So he wants to engage us now so that we can have a drastic end to the story that we're telling now. And that's why developing an attitude of learning, as we call it, just to walk across the room, is so important. Where we will put in the effort, just a little bit of effort, to walk across the room to engage somebody, to hear their story, or to be able to tell our story. This is the third week of this Just Walk Across the Room. We'll conclude it next week. But it's all about making an effort. It begins here. Are we willing to make an effort? To put a little bit into engaging people? Last week we talked about that, once you walk across that room to speak to somebody, to engage them, we talked about you got to find some common ground. Build some relationships, friendships. You got to be willing to listen to them. And then you got to be willing to take the next step. And that's just wherever God leads you to do the right thing. Now, what I want to do today is, I think, very practical. We all need a story to tell. And you may never have thought about that you have a story to tell. But that's hard for some of us to do, is to be able to tell our story. So I just want to take some practical things to give you and talk about that we can do to help us tell our story, because our story is so important. I try to make it as easy to remember as possible. It's 3 B's. 3 B's to help you remember. And the first one is this: before and after. Our story should have a before and after. Suppose you have a friend that you haven't seen in, say, 6 months, and you run into them and they just, they start saying, "Oh man, I'm so excited about these hair treatments that I'm doing. This medication, this stuff I'm rubbing on. Man, it's making such a difference." And they're talking about it, and you're, in your mind, you're going, "Oh yeah," and they were bald 6 months ago, and they're bald as you're talking to them, but they're so excited about this hair treatment stuff. You're kind of going, "I don't see the before and after." Or suppose a stranger comes up to you, or you're sitting somewhere and a stranger starts talking to you and says, I tell you, since I've been going to this counselor, it has just changed my life. My life is so much better. And they just keep going on and on. And you don't know this person, how much better their life is. You know in your mind sometimes you're going to go, well, what was it like before? You want to know because, we work in before and after. So you think that. We love before and after pictures. Marie Osmond loves before and after pictures. Advertisers love it. Think of all the stuff they try to sell us, and they show the before their product and then after their product. Spiritually, we should have a before and after. A before Christ and an after Christ story in our lives. Jesus was traveling along, and he with his disciples, and they're talking, going along, and he comes up on somebody, and it says this in John 9:1. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. Most of you remember the story. Jesus with his disciples, they see a man that's just been blind from birth. And the story goes on that Jesus takes just a little bit of spit and some dirt and makes mud, and he rubs it on the man's eyes. And he says, now go to the pool of Siloam and wash, and you'll be able to see. He goes and does that, and his sight comes back to him. And it says his neighbors see him and said, hey, aren't you the blind guy? And he says, well, I used to be, but I see now. And so the word begins to spread, and the word gets to his parents. The word gets to the Pharisees. They call him in and say, hey, who healed you? You're the blind. He said, well, I used to be blind, but I'm not now. And a guy named Jesus, the one who did it. And they don't like it for nothing because they don't want Jesus to get any credit. So they call his parents in and say, hey, what happened to your son? And they said, why don't you ask him? He's a grown man. He was blind. He sees now. Ask him about it. So they call the man back in again. They ask him 2 more times. Who did this? And when he would say Jesus, they would say, well, he's a terrible person. He's a sinner. And then this is what he answers back in John 9:25. Whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. Before, after. Let me ask you something. For the rest of this man's life, what story do you think he told? What do you think he talked about? Down the road, years and years and years later, a grandson is there with him and says, Papa, how did you become a follower of Jesus Christ? Well, son, I'd been wanting to get a kitten, and I'd been praying, Lord, if it's your will that I get a kitten, you make it evident to me. And son, a kitten come walking by. And I knew at that point there was a real God. Do you think that's the kind of story he told? No, he told about there was one day a man stopped and he put mud on my eyes and he told me to go wash and I could see. The before and after. How about Zacchaeus? How do you think Zacchaeus, what story he told from then on? You know the story he told. Or how about the woman caught in adultery? They were ready to stone her to death, but then when Jesus was finished, they had dropped the stones. They were left standing alone in a street where they could talk. What story do you think she told for the rest of her life? And how about you? What's your before and after? What is your before and after? When if you were to sit there, and you should be able to do this in 100 words, write your story. We're not talking about writing a book. We're talking about something you can tell somebody in a few minutes. Does your story have a before Christ and an after Christ element to it? Now, this may sound harsh, but if it doesn't, I'm not sure you've met Jesus. Because Jesus changes things. I was alone, but now I feel like I belong. I spent my life afraid, but now I have a peace. I was greedy. I was always looking after the dollar and what I could get next, but now I just love being able to give. I was angry all the time. But now I have joy. I was heading down a road that I knew that was going to end up bad for me and my family, but now my family is right at the top now. I wouldn't do anything to hurt my family. Before and after. Our story should have another B in it here. And that's build a bridge. Build a bridge. On January 5th, 1933, construction began on what we know as the Golden Gate Bridge. On May 28th, 1937, a little over 4 years later, the first automobiles crossed the Golden Gate Bridge. Why do people build bridges? Why do they go to the trouble to dig canals to, you just start thinking, I was riding to Virginia Beach the other day in that Dismal Swamp Canal that's on, I think about how much work back in the day went into something like that. Why do we do things like that? And you say, well, it's to make money or what? Yeah, I get that. But there is something in the heart of mankind that wants to connect things, that we want to cross over something. We want to build a way to get to another place. It's always been that way. And it's not just physical. Our makeup, we're mentally trying to build a bridge from one place to the other. Spiritually, it's the same way. Study all the religions of the world, and they have this one thing in common. We're trying to get from one place to God. And as you look at these religions, whoever they say God is or what God is, they're always trying to reach from where we are to where God is. And it's always something you've got to do to get there. Find a way to get to this holy person, with the exception of one religion of the world: Christianity. Biblical Christianity. God is the one who built the bridge. It wasn't my effort. It wasn't yours. It wasn't a group effort of a church or a movement. God spanned the gap. He saw the gap. He saw the impossibility of it. He counted the cost and built it anyway. The cost through a death, burial, and resurrection of His Son, Jesus Christ. And after we have accepted that gift, we can cross that bridge. And after we've crossed the bridge, it is our job to tell others about the bridge, about how to get over that. Now, this is what I think very practical for us all here. I want to share 3 little simple things that you can take a pencil and a napkin if you're talking with somebody and draw an illustration that will just explain what Jesus has done. I want to give you 3 of them here. And the first one is simply called the bridge. And you can just take a pencil, pen, and draw this. And write on one side, as you're talking to this person, write on one side, us. And just say, that's where we are. And you draw the valley, the chasm here. And you write at the bottom, sin and rebellion. And you explain, you say, hey, we're on one side here and God's on the other. You write Him up on the corner there. But what is separating us from God is all of our sin and all of our rebellion. And it's impossible for us to get to God. No matter how hard we try, we know we can't get across. And then you simply draw this on your napkin, the cross, and say, and it was God who chose to build a bridge. And you can explain how Jesus came and died on the cross and said, it's available to anyone who will take it, so that we can walk right. And if you can remember one verse of Scripture to use with this little illustration, is John 5:24. It goes this way: I tell you the truth, and this is Jesus speaking. He says, I tell you the truth, whoever hears my word and believes Him who sent me has eternal life and will not be condemned. If you can't remember the whole verse, remember the end. He has crossed over from death to life. Anybody can do this. Anybody can keep this in their mind and practice that a couple of times on a piece of paper and know when you're talking with somebody how to share that. Well, maybe there's a person that this doesn't really appeal to. There's another one. I call it do versus done. Write this on a little piece of paper. And you might just want to start by just writing do on a piece of paper. And you just tell them, that every one of us we feel compelled that we've got to do something to make things right. We've got to do something to get to God. We've got to do something to fix what's wrong between God and I. And that's what most people do. We work and work and work and just try to be better and better and better. And we're frustrated. Then just draw a line and write done under it. He says, most religions are talking about what we do. But Jesus says it's because of what I've done. And you can tell them that, say, Jesus, when he hung on the cross and he was ready to die, he said, it is finished. It's done. There is a way now from you to get to me. And whether they accept Jesus Christ right now or not, that's an illustration that they can always remember. You can always remember. One more I want to share with you. You can do this right on a piece of paper, or a napkin, whatever, too, and it's called the ladder. Just take and scribble, draw a little ladder. The rungs of a ladder on a piece of paper. And as you're sitting there talking with somebody, you can write God at the top and say, no, this is someplace, and this is a morality ladder, saying, if you think of what is perfect, who's at the very top, we would say God is up there. And then you come down to the bottom one, and you can let them think, what's the worst person or group of people you can think of? And somebody might say, well, I think a serial killer. I think somebody would go into a high school and shoot the place up. I think it's a terrorist. I think it's somebody that abuses. You can write down what they are. If they're the worst they can think of and God's the best, you put them on the rungs of the ladder. Then you go, let's think of somebody that you respect the most, that's just as close to God as you can think. And try to think of somebody famous. And since Billy Graham has been in the news a whole lot, here lately, you might would put in initials, Billy Graham. BG. And it'd be somewhere up the ladder, and you say, well, think about somebody you know personally. And it may be, my grandma. There's no one better than my grandma. And you write her in. You might do 2 or 3 of those. You say, well, where do you put you on that ladder? And we're always going to put ourselves below a Billy Graham or how good grandma was. And then all you can say is, when we look at this ladder and look and we see where we are, and we look and we see where grandma is, Billy Graham, none of us stack up. None of us got up the ladder. From the serial killer all the way to the greatest person on earth, we didn't make it. And we need a plan. And the plan is I'm never going to be able to climb high enough, but he said he would come down to get me. And you can tell them about Philippians, where it says, he left the glories of heaven to come down to rescue us. My friends, any of us can do this. All of us have got memory enough to do these things. These 3 little drawings tell a story. They help you tell a story. They're the story that Jesus wants us to tell. People are somewhere in one of these 3 illustrations, if not in all of them. The people you meet, the people sitting here, are or have been in one of those illustrations somewhere before they came to know Christ. You can do that. I can do that. Because people are struggling. They feel powerless. They feel lost. They don't know where to turn. They're confused about themselves, confused about the world, and even confused about God. And they may see God in a whole different way after seeing him described this way. Our job, the bridge has been built. Our job is to introduce people to the one who built the bridge. I read this verse last week, but I want to read it again from the New Living Translation. It just says it a little bit different. 1 Corinthians 3, 7 and 8. Remember, this is where Paul was talking about, because people were arguing between who was the most important, Paul or Apollos. He said, it's not important who does the planting or who does the watering. What's important is that God makes the seed grow. The one who plants and the one who waters works together with the same purpose, and both will be rewarded for their own hard work. And that purpose is for us to introduce people, just to introduce people to God. Little effort, little intention on our part, and we can be the one who plants or waters. There's a third B that I want us to look at here, and that's bring hope. Bring hope. Before and after, our story has to have a before and after. We have to be willing to build a bridge. And third, we need to bring hope in every situation we're in, whether it's a total stranger, whether it's a family member, a best friend, somebody you work with. Now, if I said it right now that a scripture was going to come up on the screen and we were going to read it, but the power went off and you couldn't bring it up on the screen, it wouldn't make any difference because you know this one. John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. Like I say, the power could go off and it wouldn't affect us one bit on knowing that one. But there's a less popular verse that follows that. And that's the one I want us to focus on because we know this, we know how true this is. John 3:17 says this. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Did not come to condemn the world, but to save it. I'm afraid sometimes that once we've walked across the bridge, once we've been across long enough, and some years go by, we forget this. Because there's so much to condemn in this world. There's so much that just breaks our heart and can even make us angry. But that is not our job to condemn the world. Our story is to bring hope. Our story is to be the same as Jesus. If Jesus said, I didn't come to condemn the world, but to save it, then that needs to be our story too. One of the problems we have as far as how the non-Christian world looks at the Christian and the church is that they see us as very condemning, right or wrong. That's one of our problems that we have. As people see God, they see his people as being condemning. So if we're going to bring hope, we can't go into it with any arrogance, any pride, any judging, any condemning. We can't tell our before and after story, well, I was like you, but now I've got my act together. Now I tithe every week. I pray 4 times a day. I read my Bible. You're not bringing hope. You're condemning in that. We can't go into that. We've got to extend hope. And the reason we have to extend hope in every story is because we never know how close salvation is. Let that sink in for just a second. We never know how close salvation is. I do this intentionally. I've been mentioning these same people for several weeks. Zacchaeus. Do you think that he thought that salvation was that close the day he decided to climb up a tree to watch Jesus go by? Did he think he really thought that he was one shimmy up a tree and shimmy back down and sit down to dinner with Jesus from changing his whole life? No. But it was that close. That's how close it was. The adulterous woman caught in the act of adultery. Let that sink in for a second. She was caught in the act. Do you think she was thinking this day, my life is going to change forever today? I'm giving it to God. When she was dragged out into the streets and came within the hair of her life of being stoned to death right there in the streets. But a man named Jesus stood up for her and caused them to drop the stones and left them alone in the street where they could talk. And he said, I don't condemn you. He says, go and leave your life of sin. Sin no more. She was that close. and she didn't even know it. But she was. How about the woman at the well? Love that story. The woman at the well, she was just going to draw water. Something that a woman of that day did every single day of her life. I don't think she thought she was going to meet a Jewish man at the well who would ask her for a drink of water and her whole life would change. But he asked her, and they talked, and she became a follower, and her life was never the same. Salvation was that close, and she didn't even know it. Every person we meet is that close. Either that close to salvation or that close to giving up altogether or to giving up on a marriage, giving up on a child that they've invested their whole lives in, but nothing's in return. That close to walking away and giving up on everything of a dream that they have and walking away as a loser. They're that close. And your story, your little story, may contain the hope that all it takes is to keep them hanging on. Hanging on and wanting to hear the story of Jesus. They're that close. And we never know it. Your story, your effort may be what brings someone to hang on. Brings someone to want to know more about Jesus. And that's why our story must be a story of hope. That's why we must always be ready with a story, because we're that close. You're here to extend an invitation. That's why I'm here. Jesus left us here. If it was all about just becoming a follower and going to heaven instantly, that he would have plucked us off of this earth way before then. Now. But he's left us here to extend an invitation to as many people as possible. Come join me. I want us at this time, we're going to close our service just a little bit different. We usually sing an invitation hymn, and this will serve in that place. But I want you to watch and listen to this song and just see the beauty, the value, the purpose of an invitation. If there's somebody here that's ready to accept that invitation as well, just join me down here. Let's watch this.
We all start on the outside looking in. This is where grace begins. We were hungry, we were thirsty, with nothing left to give. Oh, the shape that we were in. And just when all hope seemed lost, love opened the door for us. He said, come to the table. Come join the sinners who have been redeemed. Take your place beside the Savior. Sit down and be set free. Come to the table. Come meet this motley crew of misfits, these liars and these thieves. There's no one unwelcome here. And that sin and shame that you brought with you, you can leave it at the door and let mercy draw you near. So come to the table. Come join the sinners who have been redeemed. Take your place to the prisoner and the soldier, to the young and to the older, all who hunger, all who thirst, all the last and all the first, all the paupers and the princes, all who failed, you've been forgiven, all who dream and all who suffer, all who loved and lost another, all the chained and all the free, all who follow, all who lead, anyone who's been let down, all the lost you have been found, all who've been labeled right or wrong, to everyone who hears this song, come to the table, come join the sinners, you have been redeemed, take your place beside the Savior, sit down and be set free, oh, sit down and be set free, come to the table, come to the table, sit down and be set free, come to the table.
Life may not seem that simple, but the invitation is. It's just that simple. I know you know someone that needs an invitation to the table. Maybe you. And I pray that we'll be the people who extend it. And we'll put in the effort to do that very thing. Imagine a story on this side of the cross, no matter how good or bad it is, what it's going to be on the other side of the cross when we're all at the table together.